Spring had arrived with a gentle flourish on Maplewood Lane, a quiet suburban neighborhood where sidewalks were smooth, mailboxes were uniform, and neighbors waved from their porches like extras in a nostalgic movie. The sun stretched lazily across the rooftops each morning, casting golden light on the freshly cut lawns and pastel-colored houses that lined the peaceful street. Birds chirped high in the trees, dogs barked from behind white picket fences, and the scent of fresh soil mingled with blooming lilacs in the air. Amid this picture-perfect scene lived Maria Lopez, a soft-spoken woman with a warm smile and a passion for gardening that could rival any professional horticulturist. Her front yard had become the crown jewel of the neighborhood, a lush canvas of color and life, bursting with blooming roses in shades of scarlet and blush, towering sunflowers that leaned cheerfully toward the sky, delicate lavender swaying in the breeze, and a tiny little vegetable patch that produced juicy tomatoes, crisp cucumbers, and fragrant herbs. She spent her early mornings in dirt-stained gloves and a wide-brimmed straw hat, tending to her plants with the same care and patience one might give to children. Maria's garden wasn't just beautiful, it was alive, and it radiated a sense of joy that made passers-by smile and even slowed their cars for a better look. But not everyone admired the floral paradise Maria had cultivated. 3 houses down lived Karen Whitmore, a rigid, sharp-eyed woman who had long declared herself the neighborhood's unofficial authority on all things proper and regulated. Clad in pastel polos and perpetually clutching her clipboard, Karen had an encyclopedic knowledge of the Homeowners Association rulebook and wasn't shy about quoting it, often out of context. She had once filed a complaint about a neighbor's mailbox being 2 inches too modern, and famously argued that garden gnomes were visual clutter, detrimental to property values. Years ago, she'd attempted to grow a garden of her own, planting hydrangeas, marigolds, and a few tomato plants, but after a few failed attempts, a stubborn aphid infestation, and a particularly hot summer that crisped her flower beds, she'd given up. Instead of nurturing plants, Karen had taken to nurturing grievances. She became Maplewood Lane's resident watchdog, patrolling her street with military precision, wielding a tape measure like a sword and binoculars like a magnifying glass of justice. If someone's trash bin was out 10 minutes early, Karen knew. If someone painted their shutters the wrong shade of beige, Karen filed a report. And when it came to Maria's garden, Karen watched it with a mixture of bitter fascination and unspoken envy. To Karen, Maria's blossoming yard was an eyesore dressed as art. The trellises were too tall, the sunflowers were borderline invasive, and the mix of vegetables and flowers was a clear zoning violation. Never mind that the HOA guidelines were vague at best and that most of the neighbors loved Maria's garden, it offended Karen's sense of order. She didn't see a celebration of nature, she saw rebellion. To her, Maria was a rogue gardener, a free spirit who dared to defy the unspoken rules of suburban uniformity. And this year, it seemed Maria had taken things a step further. She'd added a new pathway made of mismatched stepping stones, installed a small fountain that gurgled softly, and constructed a trellis with climbing roses that reached gracefully toward the sky. To most, it was charming. To Karen, it was war. At first, Karen began her offensive with subtle tactics. Anonymous notes appeared in Maria's mailbox, typed neatly and folded crisply, citing random sections of the HOA handbook. Per HOA Guideline 5.2.3. Decorative structures must not exceed 36 inches in height. Another warned about potential vermin concerns associated with vegetable gardens. Maria, initially amused, brushed them off. She had always been on good terms with her neighbors and didn't suspect the notes came from anyone serious. But as the weeks went on, Karen's efforts became more blatant. She began stopping by uninvited, clipboard in hand, offering suggestions that felt more like thinly veiled demands. "You know, those sunflowers are awfully tall this year. Would hate for them to block a driver's view," she'd say with a tight smile. Or, lavender is lovely, but bees can be a nuisance. Have you considered plastic plants instead? Maria, always polite, tried to maintain grace. She thanked Karen for her concerns and carried on gardening. But Karen wasn't used to being ignored. She started keeping a record of the garden's changes, snapping photos from the sidewalk and muttering into her phone about evidence. At one point, she even walked onto Maria's lawn with a measuring tape while Maria was inside, an act that crossed a boundary Maria could no longer ignore. When confronted, Karen claimed she was just inspecting a potential hazard and accused Maria of having an attitude. Despite the rising tension, the rest of the neighborhood had begun to rally behind Maria. Neighbors complimented her garden daily, and some even asked for advice on starting their own. Children loved to walk by and point out their favorite flowers. An elderly couple down the block brought over homemade lemonade one Saturday and called her yard a little slice of heaven. The contrast between Karen's rigid enforcement of imaginary rules and Maria's quiet dedication to natural beauty couldn't have been starker. It wasn't just about flowers anymore, it had become a symbol of individuality versus control, joy versus pettiness. As spring unfolded in full, Maria's garden bloomed even brighter, drawing more admiration with each passing day. But Karen's resentment festered like weeds in a neglected bed. She watched from behind her blinds, seething at the sight of Maria laughing with neighbors and snipping herbs with scissors in the sun. The battle lines had been drawn, and Karen, armed with her clipboard, camera, and righteous indignation, was preparing for escalation. She had Maria in her sights. And she wasn't finished yet. Karen Whitmore had never been one to back down when she felt a violation of neighborhood standards was occurring under her watch, and in her mind, Maria Lopez's flourishing garden was quickly becoming the most egregious offense Maplewood Lane had ever seen. After weeks of passive-aggressive notes and subtle jabs failed to yield the desired results, Karen kicked things into high gear. She began her campaign with a formal complaint to the HOA, citing an array of loosely interpreted infractions: visual obstruction, overgrowth, potential insect overpopulation, and even aesthetic disruption of uniform neighborhood themes. Of course, most of these weren't actual violations, and the HOA board, composed of retired residents more interested in pickleball than plant politics, politely dismissed her concerns with vague reassurances and gentle suggestions to let it go. But Karen was undeterred. What started as a single complaint soon turned into a full-fledged crusade. She stood at HOA meetings armed with photo printouts, timelines, and charts detailing the growth trajectory of Maria's sunflowers. She mailed out flyers with bold red text about the dangers of unregulated flora, and even proposed a new ordinance requiring pre-approval for any garden expansion beyond aesthetic basics. Her proposal was met with awkward silences and muffled laughter. When she didn't get the reaction she wanted from the HOA, Karen took her campaign door to door. She knocked on her neighbors' doors holding her binder like it was a law textbook, asking them to sign a petition titled, "Preserve Neighborhood Standards, Stop the Overgrowth." Most declined, some closed the door mid-sentence, and a few gently told her that Maria's garden was the best thing to happen to the block. Still, Karen persisted, increasingly irritated by the support Maria was getting. One afternoon, after seeing a group of kids take selfies in front of Maria's garden arch, she muttered loudly enough for Maria to hear, "What is this, a botanical amusement park now?" Maria, trimming basil nearby, simply smiled and replied, "Just trying to make the world a little greener, Karen." That smile infuriated Karen more than anything. In her mind, Maria was smug, defiant even, and the more the community rallied behind her, the more Karen's frustration boiled over. So she took things further. Every morning, she began pacing along the edge of Maria's property line, holding her phone up to take evidence photos, often muttering HOA codes as if reciting incantations. She complained about imaginary bee swarms, unpermitted irrigation, and even accused Maria's birdbath of attracting aggressive wildlife, which turned out to be a single squirrel. The final straw came when she announced, during a community potluck, that she was considering contacting authorities over what she described as a public nuisance. The statement caused a collective gasp, and Maria, calm but firm, told Karen directly, "You're going too far. It's a garden, not a crime scene." But by then, Karen's obsession had consumed her sense of proportion. What began as a petty rivalry was quickly spiraling into a full-blown neighborhood drama. And deep down, everyone knew, it was only a matter of time before Karen took things too far. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon when Karen Whitmore finally crossed the line from annoying neighbor to local spectacle. The birds were chirping, kids were riding their bikes up and down Maplewood Lane. And Maria Lopez was in her front yard, lovingly tying up a fresh bunch of climbing roses on the new wooden trellis she had just installed over the weekend. The trellis, painted a soft cream color and adorned with tiny solar-powered fairy lights, added a magical charm to the walkway that led through her garden. Maria hummed quietly as she worked, unaware that just 3 houses down, Karen was watching through her window like a hawk eyeing prey. To Karen, this was it. The trellis was her smoking gun. It had to be taller than 48 inches. It might even be a structure, which, according to her favorite section of the HOA handbook, could require pre-approval. She grabbed her phone, dialed, and with perfect seriousness in her voice, reported what she called a possible code violation with potential safety risks. But she didn't call the HOA. She called 911. The peaceful calm of Maplewood Lane shattered 20 minutes later when 2 police cruisers rolled down the street, lights flashing, sirens blipping once in. Warning. Neighbors peeked out from their blinds. Some stepped onto porches. A few grabbed phones to film, already guessing who was involved. Maria stood frozen with a garden trowel in her hand, blinking as the officers approached her with cautious professionalism. "Ma'am, we received a report of potential hazardous materials and unauthorized construction on the premises," one officer said, barely able to keep a straight face as he gestured toward her trellis. Maria stared, then slowly raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding." "Afraid not," the second officer replied, glancing at Karen, who was now standing at the edge of Maria's yard, arms crossed triumphantly, a smug smile stretched across her face. "She's using unapproved fertilizers. There could be runoff. It's not safe," Karen insisted, stepping forward. "And look at that thing. What if it collapses and someone gets hurt? Or attracts more of those bees?" The first officer took a deep breath, looked around at the meticulously cared-for garden, the tiny solar lights, the soft buzz of bumblebees that were as harmless as the breeze, and turned to Karen. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this is a residential garden, not a hazardous site. There's no emergency here." The second officer added, more firmly now, "Calling 911 for non-emergencies is a misuse of public resources. We'll have to issue you a formal warning." The smugness melted from Karen's face in an instant as gasps and giggles bubbled from the growing crowd of neighbors. Phones were filming. One neighbor even whispered, "Oh my God, she really called the cops over flowers." Karen turned red but held her ground, sputtering something about HOA standards. Maria, meanwhile, simply looked at the officers, smiled apologetically, and said, "Would you like some fresh basil? It's organic." The officers chuckled, declining politely before heading back to their cruisers, shaking their heads. By nightfall, a video of the entire scene was circulating online under the headline, "Phone 911 over a garden. Karen goes too far again." The neighborhood had seen drama before, but nothing quite like this. In the days following the infamous 911 incident, the neighborhood of Maplewood Lane found itself buzzing with a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and sympathy. Mostly for Maria Lopez, whose garden had unwittingly become the epicenter of a suburban showdown that no one had anticipated. The video of Karen Whitmore's dramatic call, complete with her passionate complaints about in regulated botanical chaos, had gone viral, accumulating thousands of views and comments from people all over the country who were equal parts entertained and horrified by the spectacle. Maria, ever gracious, took the newfound attention in stride, receiving messages of support from neighbors and strangers alike. Local news stations caught wind of the story, and soon Maria was invited to share her gardening tips on a popular morning talk show, delighting viewers with her calm demeanor and green thumb wisdom. Meanwhile, Karen found herself the subject of memes and social media jokes, her reputation as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer forever altered. The Homeowners Association, which had previously tolerated Karen's aggressive policing of rules, was forced to reevaluate her role after multiple neighbors submitted formal complaints about her overzealous behavior and misuse of community resources. At the next HOA meeting, Karen was politely but firmly stripped of much of her authority, with a new guideline emphasizing neighborly respect and reasonable boundaries. Back in her yard, Maria's garden seemed to flourish even more as if fed by the energy of the community's support and the strange fuel of local fame. Visitors came to Maplewood Lane to take photos beneath her trellis, admire the fragrant lavender, and taste the fresh herbs she happily shared during impromptu garden tours. Children from nearby streets learned about bees and butterflies, and neighbors began collaborating on small planting projects inspired by Maria's example. The garden had transformed from a source of conflict into a symbol of community resilience and joy, showing how passion and kindness could overcome pettiness and control. Karen, on the other hand, retreated somewhat from public view, her vigilant gaze softened by the consequences of her actions, and the neighborhood finally settled back into its peaceful rhythm. But the story of the garden, and the woman who called 911 over it, remained a favorite anecdote, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things, like a patch of earth and a few blooming flowers, could grow into something much bigger than anyone expected.